Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jesse Fergali, and you're listening to Working Capital, the real estate podcast. It is my special honor to have Walter Edward Block on the show. Walter is an American Austrian School economist and anarcho-capital theorist. He was the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar, Endowed Chair in Economics at the School of Business at Loyola University in New Orleans, and a senior fellow of the nonprofit think tank Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. How's it going, Walter?
Pretty good. I want to add, I'm not just an American economist, I'm also a Canadian. I worked for the Fraser Institute for about 12 years, from 1979 to 1991, and I am a Canadian citizen. So I'm also, I don't know how to say out and about yet correctly, but otherwise I'm a Canadian as well.
You're out of the closet on the Canadian front. That is news to me. Were you born in Canada or just citizenship?
Brooklyn, New York.
Okay, that's what I thought. Interesting. Okay, well, for those that don't know, on the podcast we mainly talk real estate with, as listeners know, we sprinkle in economists. I think you're definitely unique in the sense that some of your thoughts may not be in the mainstream of your typical left-right kind of political ideology. I kind of discovered you in high school, actually, with some of the works that I think you wrote in the 70s, if I remember correctly. And I just think that some of the concepts that you talk about touch on real estate, rent control, some of the economic aspects, minimum wage. But for those that don't know your work, don't know you, Walter, maybe you could give a bit of a background. What was your journey, becoming an economist and what you do today?
Well, it all started with me and Bernie Sanders. Bernie and I went to high school together. We overlapped for 4 years, and we were sort of buddies because we were on the same track team and we ran the same events. I have to tell you my Bernie Sanders joke. It's not at his expense. Bernie Sanders' joke is that Bernie doesn't run away from much. He didn't run away from socialism, even before socialism became as popular as it is now, thanks in part to his efforts. He didn't run away not only for ex-cons voting, but even convicts voting. But there's one person that he ran away from, and that's me. Why? Because we both did the same event, about a mile, and his time was about 4:30, and I never broke 5 minutes. So we'd start off at the same starting line, and he would run away from me. That's the joke. So I was a pinko like he was, and then we both graduated Madison High School and went to Brooklyn College together for a year, and then he went off to University of Chicago. And then Ayn Rand came to lecture at Brooklyn College, and I was not an Ayn Rand fan because she favored capitalism, and everyone knows capitalism is evil. It exploits the poor, it ruins the environment, the whole bit. And after her lecture, there was this invitation from the Ayn Rand Studies Club that had invited her to speak at Brooklyn College. And there was this long, long table, maybe 50 people on the side, and Ayn Rand was sitting at the head of the table. And her chief lieutenants, Ellen Greenspan and Nathaniel Branden, were sitting next to her. And the only empty seats were way at the other end. So I turned to my neighbor and I said, well, capitalism is evil, socialism is great. And he said, I wanted to, convert somebody to the one true faith, socialism. And he said, well, I don't really know that much about it, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I went over there. I stuck my head between Ayn Rand's and Nathaniel Branden's, and I issued my challenge. I was maybe, 22 years old, and Branden maybe 35, Rand 50. And Branden was very nice. He said, I'll come to the other end of the table. There's no room here to speak, but on two conditions. One, you don't allow this conversation to lapse. Do you hear talking? Oh, it's a, what do you call it? An echo.
An echo?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's sort of annoying if you could get rid of the echo. I think yes, it's gone now. So anyway, hopefully you can cut out that little bit. Brandon came over to my end of the table, and we had a nice little discussion. And the two criteria were, one, that we don't allow the conversation to lapse until we settle it, and two, I'll read two books that he recommends. Well, the two books were Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. I read the books. I couldn't put Atlas Shrugged down. It really knocked the socks off of me. And I went to his house a few times, Ayn Rand's house a few times, and I was converted. I was now a free market not a free market economist, but an advocate of free enterprise. And I was still an undergraduate at Brooklyn College. And then I went to Columbia for a PhD, and I met Murray Rothbard, and I don't know, that's all she wrote. I'm a big fan of Murray Rothbard, who is an anarcho-capitalist free enterpriser. And that's roughly my position. I'm also an Austrian economist. Austrian economics has nothing to do with the country Austria. It's just that the people who started Austrian economics were all in Austria. Von Bewirth, Menger, Mises, Hayek. It's sort of like the Chicago school. It's got nothing to do with the economics of Chicago. It's just that Milton Friedman was there, George Stigler was there, and Gary Becker was there. So that's how the name Austrian came about.
No, that makes sense. And I think von Mises, Hayek, I think would all be considered from the Austrian school. Human action, I think, would probably be on the top of the list for that. And what would you recommend for Hayek for those that would want to kind of get a taste of his work?
Well, I would recommend Human Action first, and then Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard second. And Hayek, Prices and Production. I'm a big fan of Hayek as an Austrian economist, a little less so of him as a libertarian. His libertarian book would be The Road to Serfdom.
So part of the kind of, if somebody has seen your work before, it's possible they've tuned into Reason TV. I think is probably a fair place to have classical liberals, libertarians. From a Canadian point of view, we don't necessarily have a dichotomy between right and left in the same way that, our neighbors to the south do. But for those that are trying to understand, when you say anarcho-capitalist or libertarianism, I think, we're starting from a non-aggression principle, but somebody that doesn't kind of understand that scheme, could you kind of put that out there and where does that sit in the political landscape?
Well, we don't really fit too well in the left-right political spectrum, because on economics, we're very much right-wing. Get rid of the minimum wage, get rid of welfare, get rid of tariffs, get rid of rent control. Whereas on social issues, we're very left. For example, legalize drugs, all of them. Legalize prostitution, legalize pornography, legalize everything between consenting adults. So when I take those tests, I come out as a moderate. And believe me, I'm not really a moderate, because half the time I'm on the right, half the time on the left. So I get plugged in as a moderate, which is silly. Namely, we should have a two-dimensional spectrum, which would allow room for people who are right-wing on economics and left-wing on personal liberties and social interaction. Robert Nozick once said it best. He said, anything capitalist acts between consenting adults. See, the left is always on about interaction between consenting adults, but never capitalist acts between consenting adults. Well, why not? So I think the essence of libertarianism is really two foundational principles, maybe three. One of them is the non-aggression principle. It is illicit, a criminal act, to initiate violence or to threaten it. So I'm now going to threaten you, Jesse. I'm going to punch you. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. You're in Ontario. The context is such you're not really afraid I'm going to reach out and punch you. But if I was serious, that would be a crime. Now, the second thing is I admire that shirt of yours. It's a lovely gray shirt. So what I'm going to do is grab it off of your body and run away with it. Well, have I committed a crime? It all depends upon the second foundation of libertarianism, namely property rights. Who is the rightful owner of that shirt? If you stole it from me yesterday, you rotten kid, I'm just repossessing it. You're the bad guy. I'm the good guy. On the other hand, I never saw the shirt before. It's a lovely shirt. And if I grab it, I'm the criminal. So how do you determine who owns what? Well, we start, I own me and you own you. And then we adhere to John Locke, who says, if you mix your labor with the land, you clear the rocks, you put in a crop, you domesticate a cow, you're the owner of it. And then the third way is any voluntary act of buying and selling and gift giving and gambling would be licit, a way of transferring property from one person to another. So those would be the two main principles. I guess the third principle would be free association. Nobody should be compelled to associate with anyone else against his will. If I didn't want to do this interview with you, you should not be allowed to compel me to do it. And if I have a restaurant and I don't want to serve you a meal because you're too young and good looking and too much competition for me, or you're the wrong race or sex or whatever, I should have the right not to serve you, just as you should have the right not to go to my restaurant if you don't like the kind of food that I'm serving. So that would be the third principle, free association. Nobody should be compelled to associate with anyone else against their will.
So that makes sense. I think an aha moment for me when I was a little bit younger was this idea of private property rights. I guess as a younger person, I thought of them very materialistically, very, just from a corporate standpoint, from a capitalist, I should say, standpoint. When, you first hear some philosophers or political economists talk about property rights start with the human property, which is yourself. And I think that's kind of what you're driving at from kind of the axiomatic underpinnings for libertarianism or, even classical liberalism. So in terms of, if we move to some issues that we're talking about today, so let's start with one that is applicable for business and real estate right now. You mentioned the Austrian economic school. Murray Rothbard is another kind of, I guess he would have been an economist as well. I'm trying to remember which book it is right now. Let me just pull it up. For a New Liberty. I've never read that before. I'm 3/4 of the way done now. Very interesting. But there's a portion in the book that he talks about inflation, because there's this, question is that just an artifact of capitalism that we're going to go in these cycles, these booms and busts, and have inflation be just a part of, our world? Different economists take a different approach as to what is the reason for that. So what would the Austrian perspective be in terms of business cycles and the ups and downs we've seen to have over the last, 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, well, the Austrian view is that there is no tendency for the economy to adhere to either unemployment or inflation. Whereas the mainstream economists, the Keynesians and the monetarists, Milton Friedman, they have the analogy they would offer would be there's a car on a road and it's a very narrow road. And on one side there's a ditch called inflation. And on the other side there's a ditch called unemployment. And the government has got to keep the car on the straight and narrow. And in Canada it would be the central bank, and in the US it would be the Fed, because the economy is always going to veer off into one direction or the other. And this is very bad. And what I would call them the left-wing Keynesians and the right-wing Keynesians. The left-wing Keynesians are Keynes, and their big thing is fiscal policy. So if there's inflation, the government should cut back, and if there's unemployment, the government should increase. And then the monetarists, call them the right-wing Keynesians, that they would say, well, they agree with this narrow road and ditches business, but they just say that the solution is monetary policy. And the Austrians say, you're both a bunch of Keynesians and you're both wrong, and there's no tendency for the economy to go in one direction or the other. And we have an embarrassment to hold over your heads, and it's called stagflation. I mean, if the economy is going to go in one direction or the other, well, how about if it goes in both directions, which is stagflation? What do you do then? You've got no answer, Keynesians, whether right-wing or left-wing Keynesians. The Austrians say we have business cycles because the government intervenes in the economy in the first place. Namely, it increases the money supply. And we're not on the gold standard. When we're on the gold standard, we didn't have this constant move from depression to inflation and backward. So we Austrians favor laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism means government is virtually non-existent, and then we wouldn't have the business cycle. We wouldn't have inflation, and we wouldn't have well, I shouldn't say we wouldn't have any unemployment. You leave your job, and it's going to take you a month to get a new job, and you're voluntarily unemployed because you could have got a job at McDonald's for $12 an hour right away, but you were looking for something a little bit better, so you're unemployed for a month while you're looking around. You're always going to have that sort of unemployment. But we're talking about serious unemployment. You just wouldn't have any of it. And the minimum wage creates another level of unemployment. We wouldn't have that under laissez-faire capitalism. So I think that the Hayek has done good work on this, as has Mises and Rothbard. And what they try to do is show that the reason we have this is government interference in the first place.
So when people hear laissez-faire for the first time, or I think it's number one, probably the average person sees it as a derogatory term when people are using it. I don't think you mean it that way. It makes me think a bit about Hayek, where another light bulb moment for me was the discussion of free markets from the perspective of prices as signals, and just basically that through voluntary trade with people, we create the emergence of price signals, and information transmits with those price signals rather than a top-down kind of view of things. Is that, I guess on the devil's advocate side of that, you have people, and let's not even say monetarists, where they'll meet you kind of halfway. You have people saying, there's this, the stakes are too high, that we need some sort of controls. We need some sort of top-down approach to make sure bad actors are kept in line. What's the Austrian anarcho-capitalist response to that type of inquiry?
Well, if by bad actors you mean rapists and murderers, we do need somebody to stop them. And the question is, which is the best way to stop them? Is it a monopoly system of government, where the government tries to capture them and then put them through the courts and then put them in jail? That's certainly one way. The way I see libertarianism, there are really four elements of libertarianism. The top of the heap is anarcho-capitalism, no government whatsoever, and private defense agencies that compete with each other for customers stop murderers and rapists. Then next level below that would be what is called minarchism, minimal government libertarianism. And this would be the Ayn Rand view and the Robert Nozick view. And here you have a government, and it only has three institutions, and it only has one function. The one function is to protect the persons and property of the residents. And the three institutions to do that are armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, not to go exporting democracy and sending troops to Afghanistan and Israel and wherever, but just in case anyone attacks us, we kick their butt. The second one is police, to keep local bad guys off of us, not to stop victimless crimes like drugs or sex or anything between consenting adults. And the third is courts, to determine who the good guys and the bad guys are. The next level below that would be what I call constitutionalists, and this is Ron Paul's view. And the reason it's a little lower is because he favors the U.S. Constitution as he would interpret it, not as the present Supreme Court would interpret it. And the only reason it's a little worse is because it allows government roads and government post offices, which the minarchists don't allow. And then the fourth level down would be classical liberalism, and the two most famous people there are Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And there they have armies, courts, and police, and roads and post offices, plus another dozen or so things with a little bit of welfare. Milton Friedman's negative income tax. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, hey, I'm a professor. I'm not allowed to answer questions directly. I have to go around the bush. The question is, well, who should stop the murderers and the rapists? And I would say the best system is anarcho-capitalism, because if the defense agency does a good job, they'll get more customers and be able to expand their base of operations. And if they do a bad job, they'll go broke. Whereas with the present situation, if the government doesn't do a good job, it's too bad. That's the only game in town. And the reason we have good eyeglasses and good shirts and good, I don't know, scissors and other stuff is because of competition. Well, why shouldn't we apply that to defense?
It's also to take it back to even a much older economist, or not older than the ones we've been talking about, but definitely older than Nozick, Joseph Schumpeter. If people have heard of creative destruction or his work on entrepreneurship, it's so, if you ask somebody in 1950 to dream up the world that we live in today from just an ingenuity and development, we can't do that. And in the same way that we don't know 50 years from now, we're going to have so many things that we can't even conceive right now. And like you said, that happened through competition largely and through human ingenuity. And I think the case for anarcho-capitalist, which might sound like an oxymoron to some people, thinking that anarchy is only left leaning. What I think the point is that there are systems and ingenuity in education, in defense, in other functions that government does that we can't even dream up because we haven't allowed that area to actually thrive. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, enthusiastically. For me, the synonym for economics is cooperation. And to me, the more cooperation you have is the more team members you have, and also the less central direction. So take basketball. LeBron James is a great basketball player. And if he's out in 3-point zone and one of his teammates who's not as good as him is right under the basket, not being covered, and if LeBron James takes a three, he's not a good teammate. He is not cooperating. And the coach is probably going to pull him out of the game. Not that LeBron James would do any such thing. But to me, a basketball team with 5 members who all cooperate with each other will probably beat 5 team members on the other team where each of those is better, but they don't cooperate with each other. They don't throw the ball to the other guy when they're free. So that would be one instance of cooperation. Another instance of cooperation would be an orchestra of 100 people, and they're playing 64th notes by Johann Sebastian Bach or Mozart or something like that. Now, that's a great degree of cooperation, but they do have a conductor. Do you know which is the most cooperative thing that puts every other cooperative venture into the shade? Laissez-faire capitalism. What's the team size? 8 billion. All of us. We can all cooperate with each other. And is there any central direction? Not under laissez-faire. So to me, it's like a miracle. I mean, I'm just sort of reissuing Adam Smith's invisible hand here. I think it was Bastiat who was up on the Eiffel Tower and he was looking down and he saw people scurrying around, delivering this and that. And he said, how does Paris get fed? It's amazing. Now, the mayor doesn't make sure that Paris gets their breakfast, but people are cooperating through the price system, through the profit and loss system. To me, it's the most beautiful, glorious institution or phenomenon that you can imagine. It's prettier than a sunset or a baby smile. It is gorgeous. That's why I love economics, because it shows the degree of cooperation. Imagine 8 billion people cooperating with no central direction whatsoever. It puts basketball and orchestras into the shade.
No, it does. And I mean, encourage people that it's, the first time you're hearing some of these ideas when it comes to the, taking on things that have been done by the government, it seems kind of crazy. But if you actually follow some of the logic, it's interesting to see and compare it to systems that already exist and flourish today. Admittedly for me, I'd probably be, in Canada, I don't know if we'd say constitutionalists, but definitely the monetarist, somewhere in between classical liberal and monetarist, just from a practical standpoint. But I want to talk about a couple issues that are, in the media today. I want to talk a little bit about, free speech. I know it's a topic that's getting, people passionate on both sides in the States and Canada, the social media networks, and want to talk a little bit about real estate and rent control. So try to do these fairly quickly. But in terms of free speech, my assumption based on your commentary and what I've read is you strike me as a free speech absolutist.
No, there
No?
is one exception: a threat. If you don't give me your wallet, I'll shoot you. That is just a verbal statement. But if I was serious, and obviously, I'm not serious about anything like that, that would be a crime. So I'm not a free speech absolutist. There are certain speeches that should be criminalized. But blackmail, or what do you call it?
Libel?
Libel, I think should be legalized, because blackmail. I have a picture of you with your girlfriend, and I'm going to show it to your wife, and you're going to get in trouble with your wife. And I now threaten you that if you don't give me money, I'm going to show the picture of you and your girlfriend to your wife. I don't know if you're married or not, but let's assume you're married, and your wife isn't going to like this much. Well, it's true I threatened you, but I threatened you with something that I have a right to do, namely to gossip about you. And if we believe in free speech, we believe in gossip, and I can now gossip with your wife and tell her all about your extracurricular activities. You shouldn't do that, you rotten kid. And also you could approach me and say, hey, I understand you have this picture. Please don't show it to my wife. I'll give you $100. Well, this is a voluntary contract. I am selling you the service of silence. Now take libel. I now tell everyone that you take a bath with a rubber ducky. And when this gets out, you're going to be fired. Your wife is going to leave you. Your reputation will be shot. Everyone's going to think you're, a person that takes a bath with a rubber ducky. That's horrible. And you'd think that, instead of stealing your shirt, I've now stolen your reputation, which is even worse, because your reputation is worth a lot more than your shirt or your car or $100 or $1,000. But what does your reputation consist of? It consists of the thoughts of other people. Your reputation does not consist of your thoughts about yourself. It consists of everyone else's thoughts about you. So when I ruin your reputation, I didn't ruin anything that you own, because you can't own the thoughts of other people. And that's all I did, is I ruined the thoughts of other people about you. This is, I think I had a chapter in this on defending one. As I say, I've done two others, and I'm working on the fourth. So I forget which things I put in which book. But I think that would be. So to answer your question very quickly, no, I'm not a free speech absolutist. I'm pretty close. I favor legalization of blackmail and libel, and you can't. And also, what is it? I'm thinking of. I can't think of the word when I start saying, "Go kill Jesse," incitement. I now get up on a soapbox and I say, "Kill Jesse. Jesse is a bum." Have I violated anyone's rights? If somebody kills you, he's a maniac. He shouldn't be listening to me. So just incitement is free speech.
And I think most, like I would say that, threats to me would be a crime. That makes sense. I'm thinking more from the perspective of, the states have a pretty, I think generally speaking, I don't know what the polls technically would say, but compared to Canadians, probably more stringent in their views of free speech. And, when we hear, hate speech laws in Canada, hate by whose definition? And that's kind of part of the direction I'm coming from too, because there's a lot of hateful things you can say about people, but who defines hate at what time for society, I think, is really the $1 million question there.
Well, look, I hate Jews, I hate Christians, I hate Islamists, I hate men, I hate women. I should go to jail for saying that? That's ridiculous. By the way, if you deny the Holocaust or the seriousness of the Holocaust in Canada, but not in the U.S., but also in Europe, you can go to jail for that. I think that's preposterous. Look, I deny that, that the War of 1215 occurred. I don't go to jail. I deny that the Spanish Civil War of 36 occurred. I deny that the Russian Civil War of 1917 occurred. I don't go to jail. I deny that the Holocaust occurred in the 1940s. I go to jail? What's that? That's craziness. Not that I deny this. I don't want to go to jail. I'm right now in Canada, but I oppose that law. I don't violate the law, but I do oppose it.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of an extension too of what you were saying before with free association. The ability to discriminate, it has a bad aftertaste in most modern people's thinking. The idea that how would that be good, or how would that be something that you would champion? But I think you're talking about it from the right to discriminate, the right to make choices for yourself that don't hurt others, or don't. Yeah, I guess maybe you could flesh that out. That don't impact others adversely.
Well, look, we're allowed to impact other people adversely. You and I want to date the same girl, and you're much younger and prettier, and she dates you. You've hurt me. I should sue you? No, we compete for jobs. We compete for mates. We compete for all sorts of stuff. We hurt each other when we compete. McDonald's opens up next door to Joe Blow's restaurant, and people go to McDonald's instead of Joe Blow's restaurant. Well, Joe Blow is hurt, but McDonald's is not a criminal for out competing him. Now, look, this thing about discrimination hurting people. The statistics are that for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes something like 70 cents. It varies. It could be 65, it could be 75, but let's suppose that the wage gap is 30%. And a lot of people say, well, this is because men are in charge and men hate women. I tell you, most heterosexual men that I know don't hate women at all. But let's let that pass. And now people say, well, we have to bridge the gap, or we have to close the gap or narrow the gap because it's unfair to women for them to make 70 cents or $7 instead of $10 or whatever it is. But this is wrong. This is not due to discrimination. It's due to the asymmetrical effects of marriage. It's called the marriage asymmetry hypothesis. So what's going on here? What's going on here is that women do the lion's share of house cooking and cleaning and baby care, and obviously breastfeeding. Men can't do that. And we have an economic principle that whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well or at all. My favorite example of this is Usain Bolt and Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo Ma is the best cellist on the planet, and Usain Bolt does the 109.3. They really should arrest him for going so fast. He's breaking all sorts of speed limits. But how good a cellist is Usain Bolt? Not a good cellist, because he's spending all his time in the gym doing what sprinters do. What's Yo-Yo Ma's time in the 100? I'll bet you she can't even break 20 seconds, which is pathetic. Why? Because he's busy celloing all the time. So whenever you do anything, whenever you specialize in anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was at the Fraser Institute, this is one of my contributions. And what we wanted to get from Statistics Canada, was a ever married versus never married. Because we wanted to test this hypothesis, to see if there was a difference, any gap at all, between people who were never married. Now, StatsCan didn't count never married. All they had was single and married. But that wasn't good enough, because if you're single, you've been touched by the institution of marriage, you're divorced or widowed or separated or something. And they made us pay, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 to do a special thing, and they didn't much like it because they're a bunch of pinkos. And they didn't like, but what happened? There was no gap. There was zero gap between men and women who were never married. And the gap between men and women who were ever married was way bigger than 30%. So this is sort of an empirical test of the hypothesis. But look, we also have logic. Suppose that men and women, look, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there is reason to think that women's salary would be lower than men's salary because men are stronger than women on average. Look, there are women shot putters and karate experts who could kick our butt, probably. But on average, men are stronger than women. And a lot of jobs, the way we dug a tunnel was with a pick and shovel. The way we cut down a tree was with a saw. And men were stronger than women. So 200 years ago, we could see a gap. But nowadays, women can operate a buzzsaw just as well as men. They can operate a bulldozer just as well as men. So how can there be a gap? Okay, now wages tend to equal productivity. So men's productivity used to be higher than women, but now men's productivity is roughly the same as women. So suppose that all of a sudden, let's forget about men and women. Let's talk about bald people and non-bald people. And let's suppose that most people are not bald. And all of a sudden, we discriminate against bald people. Has the productivity of bald people changed? No. But their wages go down. So if their wages, if everybody's productivity is 30 an hour, and now all of a sudden bald people are making 20 an hour, somebody is going to violate this agreement and offer a bald person 21 an hour. And somebody else is going to say 22. And you can see where I'm going with this. So if women are being pushed down, but their productivity hasn't changed, somebody's going to offer women a little bit more because they make more profit off of a woman than a man. So
Yeah.
The logic is fallacious, and the empirical evidence shows that this is nonsense. And yet, the feminists are whining about this pay gap. It's just totally wrong.
Well, I think years ago I had to work with StatsCan in another life, and I don't envy that position of having to deal with them. But I will say I think Thomas Sowell, for those that don't know, another economist, I believe Chicago, is
Stanford.
Chicago is where did he do his undergrad at or I guess he was under Milton Friedman at Chicago. And then Stanford. Okay. But I think he also, I don't know what data set he was looking at, but I believe it was women that were never married and never had kids. And there was pretty much parity. Now, I have this conversation with people, and, some people like to say there is no wage gap. There's an earnings gap, and kind of crystallize or is it the other way around? There is no earnings gap. There's a wage gap.
No, there's no gap at all.
So on average, if you don't take into account what we're talking about here, if you just average everything, and I think that's where the assumption is that 30% is discrimination. And what you're basically saying is that there's a number of variables. Now, is there in that 30, is there 1%? You've done this, you've looked at this data in much more detail than I have. But when I have this conversation with people, they will say, well, there's, like you just talked about, that hypothesis, you having kids takes you out of the workforce, that is unjust. And I'm like, well, that is a totally different type of conversation than, if we want to make, as a society, if we want to deal with that, that's different than what we're talking about here, about kind of the facts on the ground. And I think you kind of laid it out there. Walter, I want to talk, so two small topics before we're going to have you back on, because these are great topics that I think do take a little bit of time to unpack. But just so two things. One is we'll end with this. I want to get your take a little bit on rent control. I think as Canadians and Americans as well, it's a hot topic from our community, commercial real estate and residential real estate, from the landlord and tenant side. But before we get there, in the news right now, it's been in front of Congress a number of times. These social media companies, the more right-leaning people who purport to be laissez-faire and purport to be free market are talking about different regulations we need to deal with these social media companies. The left side seems to, it seems to be a rare thing where they're in agreement on a lot of these things. I wanted to get, either your take or the Austrian take on social media companies and this idea of monopoly and how you view them, if you view them as publishers, or how we should look at these companies, because they are kind of a new phenomenon to a large extent that we see in kind of the corporate world.
Well, there can be no Austrian take on this, because this is a normative question. And Austrianism is a positive science. What causes what? And it's value free. I don't think there's anything new under the sun. I think that the government should not be telling anyone, to not allow hate speech on your web or anything like that. Google and Apple and X and all that should be free to discriminate against anyone they want under the ground of free association. And if the powers that be are now mainly lefty, which is true, well, then there'll be a righty or maybe a libertarian web that will come up, and it either will allow everybody and allow debates, or it'll just allow views that it likes. Look, you don't tell the New York Times editorial page, and you don't tell the Wall Street Journal editorial page to change positions. The Wall Street Journal editorial page is a National Post in Canada is pretty right wing. The Globe and Mail is pretty left wing, and I think it would be a violation of rights and anti-civilization to tell the Globe and Mail you got to have more right wing stuff, and to tell National Post, well, you have to have more left wing stuff. And if most newspapers are like the Globe and Mail, like the Vancouver Sun, lefty also, and many other newspapers are lefty. Well, if that's what the people want, that's what they should have. And if for some reason there's too much leftyism, well, then you start a new newspaper in Saskatchewan and make it a righty newspaper. So I say let freedom ring, even if most newspapers' editorial pages are very anti-market.
Okay, so the final topic here, rent control, and I want to talk a little bit about rent control and kind of the environment for landlords and tenants. It is kind of, I didn't know we were necessarily that it would happen on this day, but right now, Walter, I have a sheriff going to a property that I own with a partner of mine and evicting a tenant. And for those Canadians, yes, we still have sheriffs in Canada. To give you some context, this is it was non-payment of rent for 6-7 months in Canada today because the landlord tenant board is so backed up, and I don't think it's dissimilar than some areas in New York State and California. I think it was 10 months to get a hearing date. So if you're not paying rent, for the average landlord or the small business, that's completely wiping you out. Luckily we've been doing this for a number of years, but that's kind of where we're at right now, post-COVID in our world. Before even getting into rent control right now, do you have any views where it comes to kind of tenant relationships? Because between landlords and tenants, because I do work in commercial real estate, and there's kind of an assumption that there's a sophistication on both sides. So the law doesn't necessarily have to favor one or the other, but it definitely does seem that definitely in Canada that the laws bend over backwards to protect tenants, and oftentimes at the cost of the majority of them being small landlords. What are your thoughts on the dynamic?
Well, I don't think that rent control protects tenants. I think rent control hurts tenants as well as landlords. It's theft. Look, 6 or 8 months you're not getting any rent. Well, suppose I went into your supermarket and I started taking stuff for 6 or 8 months. I'd be arrested happily and properly. But in effect, what your tenant is doing, who's not paying rent or not paying a market rent, is stealing from you. Look, you're now selling milk for $3, and I go in with a gun and I say I'm only paying $1, and you don't like it, too bad. I'll shoot you if you don't let me out of the store with paying $1. Well, everyone knows what I'd be doing. I'd be stealing from you. Well, the market rent of your building is $1,500, and I'm paying $500. Well, I'm stealing $1,000 a month from you. And actually, in New York City, it's even worse with this thing called squatting. You go to your house, forget about rent. You own your house, your private house. You're away for a month, and you come back, and there's this guy there. And he leaves, and you change the lock, and they arrest you. I mean, you can't make this up. It sounds like I'm making it up, but it's actually true. Well, rent control is just a partial squatting. You don't want that tenant in there paying $500 for a $1,500 apartment. You can't get rid of them. Or you can only get rid of them after 10 months or whatever it is, because the landlord-tenant thing is so bollock stuff. But you see, a lot of people think that this is helping tenants. And I say, what helps tenants is more housing. The more housing we have, the more tenants are helped. Well, does rent control produce more housing or less housing? Obviously, less housing. You just inherited $1 million from Aunt Tilly. Are you going to put it in building a new building and put tenants in there? Not if you have your head on straight, because you know that they're going to come along with rent control and not allow you to charge market rents. You'll build, if you want to be in real estate, you'll build commercial, or you'll build a factory, or you'll build a mall or something like that. And if you don't want to be in residential, in real estate, you'll buy a farm, or buy a share of stock in a steel mill or something like that. But the key, I think, that we have to take away from this is that rent control does not help tenants, because it lowers the supply of housing. Look at the incentive of landlords to provide rental housing. It decreases it. Well, the fewer the housing, the more homelessness you get. So rent control does not help tenants.
So Milton Friedman, I can't remember the exact way he put this, but he talked about how, policies like rent control, they're right in front of your face. You see a cause, you see an effect. So if you're championing something, or if you're getting elected, now what you're talking about, affordable housing, well, that's a long process. It takes time. There's a lot. So is it as simple as that these larger effects, they don't spontaneously happen overnight, that we miss them? Because yes, if you take your logical conclusion that I'm in real estate, I understand that if you incentivize ownership and Canada, I should back up. Canada's so backwards now that even landlords, or developers, they'll be unsure to develop things just because they know that the government's going to change soon, and it's so precarious, they don't know which way some of these policies are going to go. But I mean, do you think it's that simple? It's just not being able to see the longer term outcomes?
Yeah, everyone should read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Yeah. It's very simple. And yet people are ignorant, economically illiterate. And there are more tenants than landlords. So if you run for office and you say you're going to eliminate rent control, you're not going to get elected. There was this wonderful group of libertarians in British Columbia called Tenants Against Rent Control.
That's amazing.
And what you have to do is get a bunch of libertarians who are tenants and who understand economics and say we're against rent control because it lowers the stock of housing, residential rental units. And we want more residential rental units. We don't want fewer. And then what happens is they'll say it's market failure. You see, we can't have enough housing, so the government's got to have socialist housing. And that's one more march towards socialism.
So what do you say to the person that will make the claim, all right, Jesse's he's a landlord. He's not adding any value to society. He's not a small businessman. He's not running the grocery store down the street. He's sitting back, smoking a cigar and just cashing his rent checks. Landlords do not add value. What am I missing there?
Well, you invested in housing. You might have built the house, but if you didn't build the house, then you bought the house from the guy who built it, and now you freed up him to invest it elsewhere. So you're engaging in commerce. You're an entrepreneur. That whole thing is silly, that you have to be actively doing something. Look, you have $100 in the bank, and the interest rate is 5%, and you get $5 a year. And you're not doing anything, but you're cashing in on previous stuff that you did. Plus, you are doing something as a landlord. I mean, if you have just one tenant, not so much. But if you have 50 tenants in a building, and this tenant is complaining about the noise from the other tenant, you have to step in and ameliorate things so that there's no crisis. No, you, as you well know, being a landlord, that you're actively doing stuff. But even if you're not doing anything, that's the labor theory of value. This is Marxism. You don't have to do anything to create value. Um, look, you don't have to do anything to create value. You could just sit there and your contribution is based on previous contributions of yours when you actively did something and are now getting the benefit of it. You saved money and you're just sitting there with your fat cigar and collecting money. You're helping the economy because you saved money and now other people can invest that money.
That makes sense. Well, Walter, we're coming up to the time here. I definitely have to get you on again to talk about a couple of these other topics. For those listeners that want to know more about you, the work that you're doing right now, we talked a little bit before the show. What's the best place that they could go?
Just Google Walter Block. There's a ton of stuff out there, interviews, books. I'm very, I have verbal diarrhea. I keep typing, so there's plenty of stuff out there.
At the young age of
82.
That's fantastic. Walter, you've been listening to Working Capital. Thanks for being part of the show.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun. Take care.